Good evening, everyone. My name is Irina, and I'm very happy to be here today in this beautiful place. And I would like to thank the European University and ENERPO Research Center for inviting me. It's been a while since we've had lectures for international students at the university. I guess you probably know about the story of the university, so I'm really happy to be here today. So I would like to speak about the future, about maybe a bit of idealistic future, but with a pragmatic approach. And why I talk about this idealistic future, decarbonization, limiting human impact on the environment as a result of our activities. Why do I talk about it from natural gas point of view? It's because I generally have the strongest expertise out of all of the fossil fuel markets, particularly in natural gas. But as it will be clear from the lecture today, the efforts to decrease the impact that our economy and our energy makes on the environment, it has to deal with all of the fossil fuels. So we cannot generally say that all we need is renewables and forget about coal, forget about oil, forget about fossil fuels, and natural gas is one of them. We have to take into consideration the energy system that we have today in place, and the measures must be taken in each of these sectors. And let's focus on natural gas. Let's see how natural gas works, and maybe how renewables alone sometimes do not really reach the target. So I will start first with a question of what is clean energy. So when we speak about clean energy, the first answer that sparks into our heads is that, well, obviously it's wind, solar, hydro, the renewables. Well, energy in itself is not, like the term clean is not really applicable to the term energy, because when we talk about energy, we talk about the mechanical energy, about kinetic energy, about some substance that helps us to move, that helps us to produce, that feeds our economy, basically that allows us to move and to produce and to work. So in itself, energy cannot be clean or dirty, but the term clean or dirty really refers to the way that we generate energy. So the way we produce electricity is really critical, and this is what we're talking about when we focus on this quality of cleanliness of energy. And decarbonization in itself, when I say decarbonization during this lecture, or when you see this term in media or in other reports, do not imagine the world which is definitively, decisively free of fossil fuels. And this is the first comment that I received when I posted on Facebook that I will do this lecture. So the first comment that popped up was from a very good friend of mine, but we never really discussed any professional topics, but he asked me, well, discussing the role of natural gas in discussing the role of natural gas in decarbonization, isn't it the same? Isn't it the same as discussing the role of coal in coal-free world? So first, I was a little bit like, wow, this is a harsh question that he's asking me. He just ultimately undermines all of the lecture that I'm going to do today. But then it's like, hey, but there is a logical fault in this way of reasoning. So coal-free world is a world where there is decisively no coal in use, while decarbonization is not carbon-free world, but this is a process that we engage into in order to minimize our impact on the environment. So why do we have to decarbonize? It is generally scientifically proven that human activities have caused the increase of concentration of greenhouse gases in atmosphere, which have been causing the greenhouse effect and have been causing the global warming. So this storyline, I think, is very well known to everyone. So if we look at the pie chart here on the right-hand side, we see that the majority of energy that is used in the world today is provided by fossil fuels. The majority, the absolute largest part of energy that we use today is coming from oil, and generally this is all of the travel that we like to do, the commute, transport sector particularly is very heavily dependent on oil. Then the second largest fuel in the energy mix is coal. Coal is the central fuel for electricity generation. All of us, when we come back home every day, we like to plug in our laptops, our phones into electricity plug-in and charge them. And this electricity, in a lot of cases, in a lot of countries in the world, comes from coal-fired power plant. So in order to charge your nice laptops, modern laptops, you do need coal-fired power plant, which is built next to your house. The third largest source of energy in today's energy mix is natural gas, and this will be the focus of our discussion today. Natural gas is also a very important fuel in electricity generation. So the number one in power generation is coal. Second largest source is natural gas, and natural gas can also be used for direct consumption in the residential sector. So when you come home, you go to your kitchen, especially in St. Petersburg, very often you would have a gas stove. So you turn on this little blue light. So this is the part of this 23% you are using every day to warm up the milk for your coffee, to cook your dinner. And the smaller colorful blocks on the top left part of the pie chart, it's nuclear energy, hydropower, and other renewables. Hydro is considered, particularly in this data set that I was using in order to prepare most of the graphs for this presentation, is given separately. Hydropower is the most widely used source of renewable energy. Why it is called renewable is because water flow is something that occurs naturally, and basically this source of energy is not exhausted, unlike the fossil fuels, which once we extract all of them from underground, we might use them all and basically run out of them. And other renewables, this category, the little green category, it includes wind power, solar power, as well as other types of renewable generation, like the tidal, the power of the tides, and also geothermal. When you use the warm water that comes out in some parts of the world from underground, and it is heated by the warmth of the earth underneath. Once again, the basis of our energy system today is fossil fuels, and in order to decrease the impact, we logically we could put our all of our attention to this 4+7% of renewables and hydropower and try to expand this part of the pie chart. But at the same time, what we could do is we can try to do something with oil, natural gas, and coal to improve the technology that exists, to maybe change the balance between these sources of energy in order to have smaller impact with the system that we already have. And I believe that the future is pragmatic combination of both. Nuclear energy is a very tricky question, and we'll see today that some of the countries in their climate related policies, they also see nuclear power as the source of energy that must be phased out. So again, nuclear energy is, from the one hand, it allows us to produce electricity without emitting carbon, because you don't actually burn any hydrocarbons in the process of electricity generation. But from the other hand, as it has been, has become clear from the accidents that have occurred throughout the history of nuclear energy industry, and one of the latest examples was the Fukushima accident, which happened in Japan in 2011. There are some environmental effects that are associated with this type of electricity generation as well. So let me turn to actually emissions trend. This data is coming from BP Statistical Review of World Energy, and it basically demonstrates the line how the global economy emits CO2. And this results from all of the fuels that we burn, that we combust in the process of power generation, in transportation, and in all of the sectors that I have briefly mentioned already. And I plotted against this graph the key developments in international climate negotiations, the milestones, the events that today determine our climate policies. So the first of them, which definitely deserves to be mentioned here, is the introduction, the launch of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And if you're interested in climate-related research put together in one place and reviewed, you may try to refer to IPCC assessment reports. They are published regularly, not annually, but with the gap of some 5 years, I think, comes in between the assessment reports. But this is the organization which basically provides the scientific basis for all of the decisions that are made in relation to climate change. It provides the basis for negotiations. The second milestone is UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was put forward in 1994. 1998 is the acceptance of the Kyoto Protocol, the previous mechanism which tried to put countries together and let them somehow work out the mechanisms to limit emissions. And there were several instruments within the Kyoto Protocol that allowed them to work toward this direction, but decisive changes did not really materialize. And the mechanisms, particularly the emission trading mechanism, which was promoted through this framework, did not really prove to be effective in the conditions, but we may discuss that later. If some of you are interested. And another important milestone is the acceptance of the Paris Agreement. So generally it was agreed upon in 2015, and a year later it entered into force when when a required number of countries responsible for the required amount of emissions ratified the document. So we see that there has been some development, step-by-step movement in international negotiations which try to do something with human activity and the climate. However, what we see is that the slowdowns in emissions trend in no way corresponds to this international activity. So this is a sad kind of combination of factors. So I put 3 vertical arrows in this graph, and all of the 3 slowdowns and even a little drop are associated with the periods when when economy was depressed for some reason. So would you guess what happened in 1973? Are there any guesses? So the hint is that during this time, economic activity was suppressed and maybe there was less consumption of energy sources. So what happened in 1973, 74, around that time? Yeah. Yeah. And what followed? Yeah, the oil price increase. So basically, the Yom Kippur War caused some countries, they supported Israel in their military, in the war with their Arab neighbors, and basically Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, they have agreed to introduce an embargo on exports of oil to those countries who have supported Israel. And basically, the countries who have suffered were the United States of America and the Netherlands were also in that kind of blacklist, but the Netherlands have the largest port, one of the largest ports in Europe, through which a lot of oil was entering the European continent altogether, and also this is the place for refining activities. So generally, yes, this political development in the Middle East caused a big crisis in oil supplies, big increase in oil prices, and reformulation basically of the entire oil market, but also by the way along the way, it also depressed the consumption of energy sources and economic activity as well, and this caused a slowdown at its little flat level in CO2 emissions. So a very straightforward connection here. The second slowdown is the beginning of 80s, which is also economic slowdown. Any guesses, or maybe you know for sure which events would this be connected to?
Maybe the beginning of Islamic State in Iran and the starting of war between Iran and Iran.
Yeah, which this happens in 78, 79, but that has also had significant impact on the oil market. So the Iranian Revolution, the Iraqi war, and following increase again in the oil prices has led to this time a longer economic difficulty in the entire world, and also this is evident from the emissions trend. And the third error there is something that all of us remember very well. I personally do not remember the 81 and 73 crisis. I only read about them in the books, but the last one I was studying in the Netherlands, and I remember the crisis of 2008-2009 very well. So this also caused kind of a depression in economic activity worldwide, and this also shows in the emission trend. So good news, we know where emissions come from and we can understand the trends. So if we know the source, we can do something with the source to limit them. Bad news. We have been trying to do something with emissions, but it has not really translated into actual developments. And the little tip, so the data set ends with 2017 because BP publishes their statistical review in June. So if our lecture would be in the end of June, then I would include their data for 2018 as well. But it has the upward trend, so there was a bit of a slowdown in 2015, 2016, but in 17 emissions went up a little bit. So where does this come from in terms of region? The largest share of emissions is, no, I don't have the light, but the blue area in the bottom, this is Asia-Pacific region. So a huge expansion since the beginning of 2000s led to acceleration of emission growth worldwide. Asia-Pacific, primarily China, but also other countries like India, like the ASEAN countries, and so on. They also start to catch up with the level of their economic activity, and people there would like to enjoy similar level, similar lifestyle as the, well, I don't really like the word developed world, but let's use it, OECD, Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. OECD includes the countries well, generally Western world, plus South Korea, plus Japan. And this Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development generally corresponds to what you would, the group of countries that you would call the developed world. And non-OECD is the developing world, which catches up, which would like to live the same lifestyle today. The second largest region in terms of emission is North America, which includes the United States of America, Canada, and Mexico. The third largest region is Europe, followed by CIS, Middle East, South and Central America, and Africa. And Africa has not yet started their decisive way into modern civilization. So when Africa starts to do that, we will probably see another analog of Asia-Pacific expansion. That's generally what is expected by a lot of researchers. Here I try to single out some leading countries. The largest emitter is China, which has slowed down in the past years, but the acceleration of the growth in emissions since 2000 has been caused by China on the first place. Then it is followed by the United States of America, the European Union, India, and some other countries. So the regional split tells us basically that the country that we have to look at most closely is China. What China does will have worldwide implications. Emissions in China exceeded those of entire North America, and they do so for some time already. Nevertheless, I would like to start with the example of Germany to demonstrate kind of the interplay between various fuels and the outcome for the emissions. So Germany is the country which has a very strong and explicitly stated policy of energy transition, and this policy is targeted at the ultimate goal is minimizing the amount of emissions, but generally, ideally, they would like to arrive at the fully renewable economy, and the energy transition does include the refusal of nuclear power. So nuclear energy has to be phased out from the energy mix of Germany. So if we look at renewable energy consumption in Germany, it's quite a positive development. So I have decided to use this old data in this unit called MTOE, million tons of oil equivalent. This is in order to be able to compare different sources of energy between themselves. So million tons of oil equivalent basically is amount of energy that is contained in a million ton of oil, and it is calculated based on energy content. So obviously when we're talking about renewables, the output would be electricity, so we would calculate that in kilowatt hours or terawatt hours if we are only talking about renewables or the electricity sector. But for the sake of comparison it with other sources, it is converted, it is done by BP in their statistical review of world energy, to this million tons of oil equivalent. It is the same as, for example, if we take food, then we can say that, okay, so this plate of pasta is the same calorific value as 3 sandwiches. So we have the sandwich equivalent, and the plate of pasta will be 3 sandwich equivalents, something like that. So it's the same kind of logic. What about nuclear energy? So clearly there is a trend for decrease, and by the way, the horizontal lines, they show the difference between the level of 2010 and 2017. So renewables have increased since 2010 by 26 million tons of oil equivalent, while nuclear power output has decreased by 15. So both of these sources of energy are non-carbon. So what you would expect is that generally, if all of the other sources of energy are left as they are, probably the emissions should decrease. Yes, so we have decreasing one non-carbon source, but we make it up and we even top it up with renewables. But the dynamics in CO2 emissions have not changed significantly. We don't see any decrease. The vertical line here shows the same year 2010, and since then it's not only hasn't it decreased, but when we look at the period 2010 to 2014-15, we even see an upward trend. And why is that? Because even despite the fact that Germany has put a very, very serious effort to develop their renewable sector, they, I don't think that they forgot about coal, but basically they thought that renewables would do it themselves. But coal, again, in this period 2010 to 2015, this gray line, and the ultimate mistake that I do here, I did not include the legend. So the gray line here means coal consumption. It has even increased during this period. But then it started to decrease again, but the role of coal is really central. So you may put a lot of effort on renewables, but that example of Germany tells us that if you at the same time let the coal industry, the coal-fired power generation stay the same as it used to be, you're probably not going to have any progress with emissions. Unlike Germany, the UK managed to cut their emissions, which is demonstrated here with the same watershed in 2010. We see a very clear decline, and since 2013 there has not been a single year when emissions in the UK have increased. So I even checked the latest reports for 2018. They continued a downward trend, although it slowed down a little bit. And here they did not forget about coal, and there was a very clear policy of coal to gas switching. So the gray line represents coal and the orange line represents natural gas. So we see a very clear interrelation between the two. And basically, UK also puts quite some effort on expanding renewables. Their nuclear power generation is at a rather stable level, so there are no they do not phase it down in the same way as Germany. But here we see that by dealing with the fossil fuel sector, it is possible to deal with the emissions. So this again tells us about the importance of natural gas. But the leading position in terms of energy usage is taken by China, where non-fossil fuel sources of energy expand rapidly. As demonstrated here, renewables grow faster and to a larger extent than nuclear. In absolute terms, as demonstrated here, the blue on the left-hand side is wind energy, and the blue on the right-hand side is nuclear energy consumption. However, the emission trend in China very clearly, and as we have already seen by the example of other countries, depends on what happens in the coal sector. So if we look at the left-hand side graph, again, the gray color represents coal, blue represents oil, and orange represents natural gas. Coal consumption trend very clearly translates into carbon dioxide emissions trend in China. So to deal with emissions, renewables only is a little help to you, but what you have to do is go to that sector which emits and do something with it. So in China there is a very strong development now named clean coal. So last year they made a bet on replacing coal by natural gas in electricity plants and also in residential heating. This year, there are news that they are placing a lot of importance on cleaning up coal and limiting the impact of coal-fired generation. So they maintain coal, and it is to be seen in the future whether this policy will have the results. But so far, China has slowed down but started to increase again in terms of emissions, and this trend clearly comes from their coal consumption trend. Measures to decrease emissions corresponds to the sector where emissions occur. So the largest amount of emissions are coming from electricity generation sector, about 40% of them. Then the second largest source of emissions is transportation, third largest is industry, and the fourth largest is buildings. Basically, the means the measures, again, they should be placed in each of the sectors. So now let us focus a little bit more on natural gas. How can natural gas be used in order to decrease the impact of each of these sectors respectively? So first of all, once again, this is the exact same information as in the previous slide. For electricity generation, the first measure is to do something with the carbon that comes out of a power plant. So CCS is carbon capture and storage. So you capture the carbon dioxide that comes out of the combustion chamber of the power plant and you store it. There is quite a strong opposition of carbon dioxide storage onshore, but there are some sites offshore in Norway where they store carbon dioxide. Carbon capture and use basically is the same. You capture carbon that is emitted that is produced in the process of fuel combustion, but then you can use it. So if you have the carbon black, you can use it in construction in order to have stronger materials that wear for a longer time, and also in a lot of other appliances. The second, why I put it first, it's because maybe this is the most logical. This is something that you can do with already existing infrastructure. The second is switching to alternative fuels. The largest amount of emissions out of the fossil fuels comes from coal. So basically, if you replace coal with something else, you would get the same amount of electricity, the same comfort of life, but less emissions in the air. And this is what is attempted in a lot of places. And even in the same power plant, you can fine-tune your equipment, and instead of coal, which is in order to be used in a power plant, it is made into the very thin powder, and it is pulverized in the combustion chamber. So basically, you can inject gas in the same chamber. It's just that for power plant, once you do the fine-tuning and you use natural gas, going back to coal is a little bit more difficult than going switching to natural gas. This is what I hear from my friends who are technical, like real technical specialists. So switching to natural gas from coal seems the most viable, the easiest option. Another option is switching to renewables, which is associated with, from the one hand, you turn to a source of energy, which during the moment when you generate electricity, you don't generate any emissions. But with renewables, there are some problems. The first problem is that in order to produce electricity from wind and solar, you have to get equipment, basically. So you have to produce it. Windmills is made of metal. Metal production is part of heavy industry. Heavy industry is one of the major emitters of CO2. And in heavy industries, in metal production, it is very difficult. It is, I think it is impossible to replace coal with anything else, because you have the blast furnaces where you produce steel, and it is not possible to use any other fuel than coal to receive the high temperatures in the furnace itself. So to produce a windmill, you go to a metal producer and to equipment producer, and you basically engage in the same traditional way of production, which emits CO2. To produce solar panels, the same story, but it is a little bit different set of materials. But again, the production of this equipment is associated with our traditional production system, which is heavily dependent on fossil fuels. So that's the first problem, is that renewables are not entirely clean. Even if you don't emit when you produce electricity, someone has emitted to produce this equipment for you. The second problem with renewables is that they're not stable, they're not constant. So the sun shines, as we all know very well here in St. Petersburg, at an unpredictable, in an unpredictable mode. Sometimes it's half an hour during the day, sometimes it's more, but relying solely on solar is a questionable outcome. Same goes to wind. There have been drops in wind generation due to low wind environment, and I saw that both from statistics in Germany and in the UK, I think in 2016, relative to 2015, it was a somewhat decreased amount of electricity generated by wind power, by windmills, because of different conditions in relation to wind. And the third problem with renewables is storage. Basically, we have invented and we know very well how to store natural gas, how to store, well, oil and coal are fairly straightforward. You just put it, and due to their physical condition, these two fuels, they tend to stay pretty much in the place where you put them. But natural gas is a little bit more tricky, but with natural gas, again, the storage techniques have been fairly well developed, while with electricity, storage, batteries, they do not provide the needed amount of storage in order to secure stable electricity supply. So today, the situation that we're in is that electricity has to be produced at the very same time that it is consumed. But all of you know that you need a lot more electricity during some parts of your day. So you wake up in the morning, everyone wakes up pretty much at the same time, everyone turns on the light, everyone turns on, I don't know, microwave or other appliances that use electricity, or they plug in their the bicycle training machine that they have at home. And this is called the morning peak of energy. Then it goes down and it continues into the time when everyone arrives at work, and also plugs in a lot of, like, the first thing you do at work when you arrive in the office. You boil the kettle, so yeah, that again increases the amount of electricity. So there is a morning peak, then it goes a little bit lower and stable level during the day, and then it increases again, because in the evening again you want to enjoy all of those things that you don't do during the day. So during the day there are two peaks, and what you would like to do is you would like to actually have that electricity. And if there is no flexible power plant which allows you to do that, then you're not going to have it. So the very best way to have a flexible supply of electricity is actually a gas-fired power plant, because you can turn it on, you can turn it off. You cannot do that with a nuclear power plant. Here in St. Petersburg, we have a very efficient system. Half of the city's electricity is provided by a nuclear power plant, and another half is provided by gas-fired power plant, which means that at least from electricity generation, we don't have a lot of pollution in the city. And at the same time, nuclear power provides the stable level during the day, and all of these peaks they are covered by gas-fired. If you have renewables, the first problem that you run into, you have fluctuating electricity supply. And the second problem, you have fluctuating electricity demand, which do not coincide. So storage is a big problem, and the batteries today do not provide for the solution. So the third switching option is nuclear energy. I am from the camp that believes that nuclear energy should be part of the climate-friendly solution. There are people who are very strongly against of it. So I guess I would like to hear some of your opinions. Maybe should nuclear energy be part of the climate-friendly solution? Going next to the measures in electricity sector in general, energy efficiency. And power lines modernization is very important. So if we use old type light bulbs in our houses, we will talk about that in the buildings, but basically that increases the amount of electricity that we use. If we use energy efficient light bulbs, basically they use up less electricity, so there is less burden on the grid, and by demanding less electricity, you also emit less from the power plant. So basically it is in the hand of every one of us in our daily behaviors to do something, but energy efficiency obviously has to be thought about on a national level and on municipal levels in order to affect the emissions from electricity sector in general. Clean coal technology, very important. Let's see what China does and how China develops this, and whether they could keep up using coal and at the same time decouple, so split this trend, so have the coal consumption trend but the decreasing emissions trend. Storage solutions, electricity storage solutions, to divide in time the moment when you produce electricity with the moment when you use this electricity. Storage is very important. So the second largest sector for emissions is transport. Again, here the first solution is switching to alternative fuels, and the second solution is effective logistics. So the first solution means that we switch from oil products, the liquid hydrocarbons that are generally today providing the largest part of our fuel for transportation, to either electric vehicles or gas-fired vehicles, and so forth. And effective logistics means that to do the same operation that we need for our daily business, we spend less energy, we spend less liquid hydrocarbons, so we emit less. For the industrial sector, which emits quite a noticeable amount of greenhouse gases and CO2 in particular, in some industries it is possible to switch to alternative fuels where the temperatures that are required in the processes are not that high. And these industries include textile, for example, cellulose, and so on. Heavy industries are very rigid in that respect. I have already discussed that a little bit, that replacing coal is very difficult there. And for building, energy efficiency is the key. Energy efficiency in general is another fuel that we have at hand, so we can have the whole other supply equal to the amount of natural gas that we use if we only apply the energy efficiency measures in a smart and consistent way. So in buildings, this means isolation, efficient construction of floors, walls, roofs, and windows, energy efficient climate control, lighting, and electricity generation with integrated equipment, so installation of the solar panels on your roof, and so on. And in some countries it even went as far as trying to sell the excess electricity back into the grid. But at least I read a very interesting book by a Scottish researcher. Her name is Susan Rove, and she wrote a book which is called Ecohouse, which in my view is the ideal example of how to, so she writes basically how to build a house which is livable, which is consistent with the environment. So don't build a glass house in the desert is something that she, I think, literally writes somewhere in the introduction. And basically using integrated equipment, which is renewable based, would be a good solution for buildings. But coming back to natural gas I think is present pretty much in every sector, maybe only in buildings, since we're talking about energy efficiency, but we can also, in the buildings where we have gas stoves, we can try to use that more efficiently. But in all of the other sectors like electricity generation, industry and transport, natural gas could definitely play a very, very strong role in ensuring that we have smaller impact, we decarbonize, while doing the things that we're used to do, while using the system that we have today. So the benefits of natural gas are in line with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which is a set of goals which was published in 2015, and today all of the efforts, I think, are trying to be in line with them. So first of all, natural gas is available, and supply systems and international arrangements as for natural gas are well developed, and they do provide, and it is proven by experience, that they are reliable. The reduction of emissions from electricity generation and transport can be reached by enhanced use of natural gas in this sector, and by using natural gas to replace either coal or liquid hydrocarbons, just because for receiving the same amount of energy from natural gas, we would emit less than if we would use coal or liquid hydrocarbons for the same purpose. Reduction of toxic emissions when used for replacing coal, oil and traditional biomass in residential sector. I haven't talked about it a lot, but I still remember my experience. I grew up here in Russia, so we don't really use, at least in big cities, we don't use coal or traditional biomass in our houses. But once I went to teach several lectures in Kyrgyzstan and Bishkek, and the first thing you notice when you go out to the city is that it really smells like burning wood, coal or something like that. So actually they burn coal in their houses for heating purposes and for cooking purposes. While it solves the problem of energy access in a lot of places where, unless they do this, they do not have any other sources of energy, and Kyrgyzstan is a fairly well-developed place, quite a progressive, could be described as quite progressive, but at the same time, it's really not good for those people who are constantly in the room while the cooking takes place because of the emissions that take place. When it is the case of a power plant, it stands somewhat further from your house, and then there is a big pipe, and then it mixes with the air, so the impact is not so immediate. But when you use coal at home, it actually can have quite a severe impact on your health and so on. So if these practices are replaced by centrally supplied natural gas, or even the the containers with compressed natural gas, which you can insert in a gas stove, this would improve the domestic situation, the air in the houses quite significantly. Natural gas has lower impact on ecosystems compared with renewable energy sources. Again, I'm ready to discuss this. I'm willing to listen to your counter arguments to this. But if we imagine a wind farm, it's a large area covered with windmills, and it looks very pretty. But at the same time, for birds, it creates obstacles when they fly. But there are these rotating parts. and as well as there are some vibrations that are caused by this, again, turning movement, but through the pole on which the windmill stands, it also spreads through the earth. So the vibration is another problem which, could be problematic for some of the creatures which live on the ground or underground, like mice and other animals. For solar, again, the concentrated solar power plant is a huge field with reflecting mirrors, and this land could have been used for other purposes. And last but not least, science, innovation, and partnership, particularly natural gas or methane, can be used as a source of hydrogen, and therefore can become a very important source, primary source for hydrogen economy, which is also very widely discussed as part of the green, economic, environmentally friendly, and economically viable solutions for the future. So this is all that I have in terms of slides, and I'll be happy to hear your comments and, of course, to answer your questions. Thank you. Okay.
Hello, and yeah, you mentioned that you want some discussion, and I guess my comment and question will be quite critical, because last time we at the lecture, the previous speaker, sorry, I forgot the name, so
Maxim Titov.
Yeah, Maxim, he mentioned that you work for Gazprom, and he promised that you will tell us some insights or something. But as he said that you work for Gazprom, I get very skeptical about your presentation, because I was thinking like, oh, she's going to say something in favor of natural gas, say about benefits of natural gas, and blame all other kinds of resources like renewables. And actually, you didn't disappoint me at this point. Yeah, and you also mentioned that you studied in Poland, and the Netherlands is a really small country, but even though they have like a lot of places where they use these windmills, and of course you know that, and Russia is much bigger than Poland, and I think we can find some fields and we can find some forests to put their windmills there, and I'm sure our territory is available and good for it. And also, you said that we don't have enough sun in St. Petersburg, but you know the weather in Poland is kind of the same. But even though they have this program and they support people who put these solar systems, solar panels on the roofs, and again, the government is very supportive of this initiative by the people, and also the problem is that Russia, Gazprom, I think, is very interested in promoting natural gas as an idea of the best way to get the energy. And unlike other countries, for example, my sister lives in Australia, and they put their solar panels on the roof of the house, and the government even pays those people who do it because it saves the environment and it helps the environment. And unfortunately, in Russia, it's not the case, and nobody's talking about benefits for people. Nobody's talking about money, but we just talk about natural gas, and it's a great picture. What do you think about it? Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. So I wanted to point out that I'm not here representing the company. I'm here representing the research that we do at the ENERPO Research Center. So I guess this is why. And secondly, I just want to share with you I want to be pragmatic, and I definitely believe that natural gas is part of that solution, but there is not one single solution. Natural gas is not that one single solution. Renewables is not that one single solution. So I'm for this pragmatic approach, seeing the best in various types of fuels and choosing the best option. So comparing Russia and the Netherlands. So you say that Russia has more land, but Russia also has somewhat more natural gas than the Netherlands does. And I think that's ultimately the difference between the two cases. So renewables is really the topic for discussion for those countries who are dependent on imports of fossil fuels. The countries who can export, who can produce more than they need for domestic consumption, they obviously, and this is not unique for Russia, they are less keen on developing this type of fuel. And also we have a rather efficient system of natural gas supplies in the European part of Russia, which very strongly depends on natural gas. Natural gas is available. It's reasonably priced, and I really think that the solution at this point for Russia is and should be different from the solution for the Netherlands. For example, our largest problem is lack of efficiency, is huge amount of wasted energy. So that is the number one problem that we have, and that is the number one problem that we should solve, is efficient use of the resources that we know how to use, that we have the system in place. So that's the number one. Renewables, renewables for the sake of renewables, that doesn't really work in a lot of situations. If you want my personal opinion about installing solar panels on the roof, when I build a house, I would probably like to experiment. So when I do that, I think we should talk again, and probably then I will have more practical hands-on advice on what should the regulatory framework be. But I believe that today in Russia the problem is really not that we don't have support for solar panels on the rooftops. The problem is that we have central heating, and when the temperature outside is high, the temperature in the house becomes like you cannot turn off the heater that is in your room, and what you do, you open the window. That's a problem. That's the first thing that we have to do, is do something with that.
Well, I just wanted to take a little bit of light, but it's okay.
Because of
okay. Maybe the... Okay. Well, basically a few things. I'm a bit surprised that you didn't talk anything about auto-consumption, houses, etc. It's one alternative. It can be basically fomented. Other thing, you don't involve the cost of transport on storage of the gas. You don't mention nothing about. You don't know.
No, I think you are first.
No, it isn't.
I think it's you.
Me?
No, I think here maybe it's...
Okay.
So could you repeat the...
No me.
Could you repeat the first thing that
Okay,
you...
yes. Basically the first thing was, you didn't mention anything about auto-consumption and house. Basically being able to supply renewable energy in buildings, etc. This could be one of that could help with domestic supplies or the domestic demand of energy. Secondly, you don't mention nothing or very little about the cost of transportation of gas and storage, what is heavily significant because you need to transport through pipelines long distance. And third, you mentioned about nuclear, but you don't involve about the cost of decommissioning the plants, which is huge. Basically, no one has been done so far. Everything says will be done, but it's not yet done. And other thing is the treatment of the residual waste in nuclear. But basically, you don't treat it, but you need to keep it in a safe storage for, let's say, could be from 100 to 1,000 years. which is a cost that the society need to get involved.
So there are costs that are associated with waste from other sources of energy as well, and the waste from solar panels and so on will also have to be dealt with. But I completely agree that the decommissioning for the nuclear is one of the major concerns, one of the major issues. The cost of transportation and storage of natural gas. Well, the point of today's presentation, it just wasn't the economic analysis and comparison of all of the figures, so I would have to engage into the calculations of the levelized cost of electricity derived from various energy sources and talk about that. So for transportation of natural gas, basically for shorter distances, pipelines are a viable solution. They have been, they continue to be. For determining the tariffs, now there are a variety of rules that are applied. Either as a sole owner of the pipeline, you calculate how much you spend on it in terms of capital investment as well as operational costs, and then you divide it by the amount of years that you would like to have the pipeline operational, and then you see how much would be reasonable to receive for that. Otherwise, in liberalized systems like we have in liberalized markets like we have in the European Union, they now require tariffs to be set clearly, transparently, the methodology has to be published and so on. Gas storage, the pricing for storage, well, I mean, if there is a gas field which was producing natural gas in a certain place, and then it was exhausted, this cavity in the ground can be used for injecting natural gas back. And what the operator of the storage is concerned is that the difference between the price of natural gas during the time when he buys the gas to put in the storage and when he takes it out to sell it is large enough to cover his operations. So basically it is the market environment. And well, building storages is another thing. There are different types of build storages. So one way is to find natural cavity to fill it with natural gas, and another way is to have a special installations like big containers or circular round containers to store. But again, the price, the cost, it's just not the kind of the subject of the lecture, so therefore I do not have any calculations at hand. For the first question, I could not very clearly understand what you asked, so if you maybe reformulate it again, then I will try to answer.
Well, it was referred a little bit regarding the renewables, especially solar panels from domestic houses. Basically, they could supply their own demand of energy, and that will help a little bit reduce the demand of the household from the grid, let's just say like this. My question with cost, maybe I reformulate it a little bit, well, not reformulate, I will explain, is because you mentioned about renewable, but I agree a little bit with her that this presentation is a bit biased towards natural gas, because the renewables, the cost of generating is not so you compare the whole cost of the whole system from you extract natural gas until you bring it, for example, to St. Petersburg and you use it, the cost involved in all this is not basically normally accounted. They only count basically the cost of when you buy the gas and you burn it, let's go to say like this. But there is an infrastructure that will need to be built before. Rather in renewables, this kind of infrastructure is not so demanding, like windmills, for example.
So let me say, restate. So you say that the cost of infrastructure for renewables is lower than the cost of infrastructure for natural gas. I think it can be lower in absolute terms just due to the fact that the amount of energy that you receive from renewables is much, much, much lower than the amount of energy that you receive from natural gas. So if you compare it on the unit basis, the transportation cost for natural gas is reasonable. The cost of the price of natural gas is very often determined by the conditions of a long-term contract, and when parties agree to that long-term contract, the selling side would always take into consideration the costs of putting infrastructure in place if they're responsible for building it. This was the case for decades in Russian-European negotiations and so on. So the price that you agree upon, the pricing formula, the pricing principle should reflect and should be able to reflect the cost of transportation. If renewables were so much cheaper, they would be everywhere. It is expensive, and this is one of the obstacles. So again, I do not have figures at hand, but in absolute terms, it might be cheaper, but only because the scale of natural gas system is much larger than the scale of renewable system as of today. Per unit of energy, renewables are more expensive.
I have two questions. The first one is, as a foreigner, living in Russia for a while, I have a detail that I don't understand why it's happening in Russia is that when it was around summer, the central heating was still working on, and I actually don't know because it never happened in my country.
And where are you from?
China.
Okay.
The second question was, in the recent 10 years that Asian country has been noticed the global warming issue, that using the gas cores and this kind of energy is an element of the global warming, especially Japan feel very threatened by this issue. So we have been working on a revolution of the restructure the energy field. And basically in China, even the second-tier cities, you can't see any public transportation which is using gas. They are all turning to the solar energy or electricity. But I have noticed that when I come to Russia, I basically can hardly find any equipment of the solar board or the public transportation. I use very traditional energy resource. I want to dig out how is the attitude of the Russia towards to the energy to the environment effects.
So I would say we at the ENERPO Research Center are working on that. But the attitude towards environmental issues in Russia, these policies in Russia, is kind of very tricky and complicated. And I mean, I'm a little bit sorry to tell about this example, but I think I will tell it nevertheless. So annually at the ENERPO Research Center, we have a conference which is called Clean Energy Forum. And we have had a representative from the municipality, St. Petersburg town hall, responsible for transportation. And basically the statement that he made not in his main presentation, but in the Q&A, was that environmental situation in the transportation sector in St. Petersburg is improving very well because people start to choose better cars. So people will do the improvement. You know, we're improving in St. Petersburg so much, but it's not because the municipality is really doing something, but because they hope that people with their personal cars will switch to the better type of engines which have better characteristics when it comes to exhaust gases that get into the atmosphere. This is from the negative side. From the positive side, I do see methane-run buses in St. Petersburg. I have seen them myself. So the buses that run on natural gas, So this, I think, goes against the statement that there is no transport whatsoever. And the second thing, you may pay attention to the fact that we have trolley buses, which is like an analog of electric bus, but it's attached to the electricity rod. Yeah, so, but it's basically a good solution. So it's the trolley buses as well as trams, so which are a very well-established part of city transportation in a lot of cities in Russia. So, and the natural gas, I think it's a new issue, and maybe it will gain its place in the transportation sector. We have also here in St. Petersburg, we have enthusiasts. I got to meet the businesswoman here in St. Petersburg. She has a Tesla car, and because she found out that there was no place to properly charge her Tesla, she started a business with charging stations here in St. Petersburg. So today, St. Petersburg is one of the best cities in the world in terms of the correlation between the amount of charging stations and the amount of cars. So I don't know, Maxim, how many electric cars are in St. Petersburg? Maybe 50?
Yeah, about 50 cars.
And 50 stations, yeah. So this 1-to-1 ratio, it's not seen anywhere else in the world, but I mean, this example of enthusiasm, and she comes and she gives lectures at the university, she promotes this, she enjoys having an electric vehicle, so, you know, there are enthusiasts who do that. So St. Petersburg actually is a very interesting place in Russia nowadays, particularly when it comes to transport. And there is another story that I want to tell about when I traveled to your country. So first I traveled in Vietnam, and then I crossed the border and I took a night train, and then I arrived in Kunming. So after an overnight train, I still remembered all the buzzing sound of Hanoi. It's like very, very noisy. Like you go step out in the street and then the noise just kills you. And then I step out in Kunming, and then I think, well, am I deaf or something? It's so quiet. And then I found out that in Kunming there was an initiative for the central part of the city to use electric buses and electric transportation and electric little motorbikes. And it was so quiet, and I couldn't believe, it was just a shock. So China is very interesting a case indeed, although still today the largest emitter of CO2. But thank you for your comments.
Rather than a critique, this is more of a question of interest, really. So a lot of international gas producing companies, especially BP, have started investing in the sort of environmental product sector because of international pressure, as well as obviously scarcity of resources. Are Russian companies like Rosneft, Gazprom doing the same thing when they have a lot of autonomy to operate in their own country and like such a glut of resources? Are they investing not necessarily in renewable energy, but in cleaner technologies in the same way and extent as international corporations such as BP?
Honestly, I will say right away that I don't know about Rosneft, I don't know about other companies, and although I'm not here to speak on behalf of Gazprom, I do have some things to share with you. So there is a certain amount of funding that is spent on research, and there are research directions in Gazprom that are targeted at these future developments we can call it environmentally friendly. And I think the year 2017 was even called the year of environment or the year of ecology and so forth. It is actually quite interesting. When I started to work at Gazprom, I got to know the people who are engaged in these scientific projects. So one of the projects is production of hydrogen from methane. So one of the ways to receive hydrogen, I think it was talked about during the last lecture when you have a representative from France, a gas from France. So you use water and you use electrolysis to split the molecule of water into hydrogen and oxygen. And then you use hydrogen for energy purposes, and the outcome of that process is again water. So hydrogen is a very promising source of energy for the future, and hydrogen is believed to play a very significant role, particularly in the European context. So what Gazprom doing with their counterparts with the research institutions from whom they order scientific works is developing of production of hydrogen from methane. You can do that by cracking the molecule of methane, which is CH4, basically 4 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of carbon. So what you get as a result is this carbon black, is a powder of carbon that you can use to produce bicycles, bricks, which are light and durable, and you get hydrogen, which is what you want for your future. So this is one research project. Another direction is what if you mix hydrogen with methane and use that in electricity generation? So the type of fuel, the new type of fuel is, I think the name for it is high-thane. So methane, the high from hydrogen and thane from methane. So it's a mix, and when you add up to 10%, if I'm not mistaken, of hydrogen to natural gas, you can transport it along the pipeline with no problem. It does not need the adjustment of the equipment, and you can use it in the power stations without noticing any differences, and even have a better energy output with less emissions, because you have separate molecules of hydrogen and you have separated carbon at a previous stage. There is a problem with this research because the research takes place in Russia, but obviously what Gazprom tells their European counterparts, they do ask, so would you be willing to transport this mixture to Europe through your pipeline system, through your wonderful pipeline system? So the answer is that because natural gas that we currently supply to European buyers is not only used in electricity generation, but also as feedstock for chemical production. We cannot just, add hydrogen and then ruin the ammonia production in some of the countries. So it has to be done on the European grounds, but Gazprom is ready to provide with solutions how to do that. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, last question maybe?
Speaking about the natural gas, as we probably know, the Paris Agreement to stabilize the reduction of natural gas is completely impossible. Like for 4 billion cubic meters, it's completely impossible. So there is actually 2 scenarios so we are that reduction, as everybody, or as we can probably see, that the expectation is the natural gas will be increased and the oil will be decreased on the other hand. So what's the main role for the natural gas, the role of natural gas in the energy transition for natural gas-based country? I mean, for the Gazprom, for instance, what kind of action they are doing for the energy transition? This is the question.
Well, what we are doing for energy transition is we're trying to be part of it. I think that's the ultimate answer. So I think there is a positive movement today in Russia that people are starting to understand that, from the one hand, there is a problem with environmental impact, and from the other hand, the policies are taking place, the efforts are taking place, and it could affect our exports, the export of our fossil fuel, and this is the way that we receive money to the budget. It is formulated by exports of oil and natural gas to a significant extent. So what we do is we try to take part in this process. The role of natural gas, one way to see it is the stabilizing role, helping out renewables, but I think this role is too humble. We have a very well-established natural gas industry which could provide solutions by itself. provide different ways of using natural gas besides just producing electricity, also a production of hydrogen. And I mean, natural gas industry could be a very important, if not central part in that. And again, today it is much easier to do something with coal-fired generation if you have natural gas than if you have to do renewable-based transition. So natural gas is, from the one hand, it could be a helping hand. From the other hand, I think it lies with the industry to really become an important part. I believe natural gas industry can do that.
Okay, I think it was time to end the questions. First, I think we can thank Irina and applause her for coming, giving her time, and explaining her lectures. I'd like to remind you that she will be here hanging out the window, so I see that you guys have some questions still, so you can just come to her and chat with her, and she will be happy to hear you. Then I would like, guys, to remind you, because I've seen some of you taking notes, that we still have this opening for publications open, meaning that if you write a short essay with your notes, you can send it to us, and if the essay is nice, we can publish it. Think about it. Lastly, I will just give the word to Georg. Before that, I'd like to remind you that we have the last lecture next week. Next week, we will have your certificates ready, so you can either come, either have the PDF version. Georg is going to have a lecture on the geopolitics of energy politics in the Caspian Sea region, which is a really interesting topic. Sorry for having it wrong. So yeah, please register, come next week, and I'm just giving him the floor now. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Is this on? It's on, yeah. Thanks, Vanille. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. I'm going to do the same exercise I did on the first week of the lectures, just a couple slide presentation of our programs. This time I think I have one more, but it won't take too much of your time. Again, just to introduce what we're doing at European University and what you can also do with us is, well, first of all, study. We offer MA programs. There's two of them, but I'd like to focus on one particularly today. It's ENERPO, Energy Politics in Eurasia, although if you're interested in Russian Eurasian Studies, History, IR, Analytical Culture, still let me know. There's also courses offered for undergraduate students, so if you're still not on an MA level, that's not a problem, just let us know. Summer schools, we're doing two of them this June and July, but in general, again, if you had other plans for this summer, then keep an eye for our new sub-dates, maybe for the next summer. But for the upcoming summer schools, our deadlines are approaching and there's still time to apply. Research affiliation for PhD students, if you're doing any research which is related to the topics that we're covering and you'd like to come and conduct some of your research with us at EUSP, you're more than welcome. The Energy Politics in Eurasia program, or ENERPO for short, is covering the following topics and much more, as I said on week one. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself for those who have been there on week one. This, again, is not a full list of all of the courses that we're covering there. There is, I think, about 10 or 12 courses for this program specifically, but there is many other courses at European University which are open and available for any students enrolled to this program. Besides the actual MA program, which can be taken as a 1-year or 2-year options, there is also other opportunities, such as the ENERPO Journal and the affiliated work with the Research Center. This is more information about how to apply to the programs. We are accepting applications on a rolling basis, which means all over the year you can write to me or to any of my colleagues, ask questions in your applications, or ask questions about how to complete your application. But there is two general deadlines to keep in mind. One is April 30 for those who want to start studying in the fall semester, that is in September, and the second deadline is October 30 every year for those who would like to start their studies in the winter, or as we call it, the spring semester, beginning in early February. And that's my last slide. That's contact information. That is my name, Georg Avetikian. You have my email there. I have my cards here. At the entrance, there is more of our materials, including our contact details if you want to email us instead of approaching us right here. Irina, I think, will still be here today if you have more questions to discuss with her or with any of my colleagues. And one last thing again to ask to keep in mind that besides the lecture that I'm going to have on the 27th, yes, on energy in the Caspian Sea region, tomorrow at EUSP we're going to have our Open Doors Day starting at 4 o'clock, so that's 16:00, not 6, from 4 to 6, and with this extension until probably 7 p.m. if we have other things to do until 5 or 6. You're more than welcome to drop by at the EUSP to see our facilities, to see our programs, to meet other colleagues of mine from other departments at the EUSP, because it's not only about these programs. But if you have missed the day tomorrow, that's not a big problem, because the EUSP's open doors are actually every day. I don't know why we have announced it tomorrow, but anyway, just so you know, you can always come to EUSP. And that's it. Thank you again.